The wind cut the dry hills of Israel, carrying the smell of earth and war. The dusty roads were traveled by hard men, faces marked by the sun and battles. Among them, a name was beginning to stand out: JABEZON. He was not king, no priest. It did not come from a noble lineage or a powerful house. But there was something that highlighted him among so many others: the fury of a warrior and the heart of a loyal servant. No one knew for sure where he was born. Some said they had come from the southern lands, among the deserts of Judah. Others claimed that he was the son of a blacksmith, raised between embers and warm iron. But in the end, it mattered little. What defined was not his birth, but what he had chosen to become. From a young age, JABEZON heard stories of the great deeds of Israel, common men who, by the strength of God, had become unbeatable warriors. But when he looked around, he saw a weakened people, looted lands, and a king who had lost the favor of the Most High. Saul still ruled, but the shadow of his ruin was already extended over the kingdom. The Philistines marched mercilessly, destroying everything in their way. Who would protect Israel? Who would get up when everything seemed lost? Subscribe to the channel for more exciting biblical stories and activate the notification bell not to miss any video. It was in youth that JABEZON made his decision. I would not expect courage to come to him. He would take his sword, shape his own destiny. It is said that his first battle was not fought in an open field, but in his own soul, fear fighting the desire for something greater. In the end, only one choice remained: departing. But where? Who follows? And it was then that he began hearing rumors about a young pastor who had challenged giants, a fugitive who gathered men in the desert, preparing to take what was promised, a king without crown, but with the anointing of God. His name was David. The nights in the desert were cold. The sky, a dark tapestry studded with stars, watched in silence the hasty steps of JABEZON. He didn't look back. There was nothing to be left. No comfort, no safety, just an ordinary past and an uncertain future. But in the chest, something burned stronger than fear: the desire to fight. Rumors over David ran among men as embers scattered around the wind. They said he was not a king like Saul. He did not hide behind soldiers, did not take refuge in palaces. He was a warrior, a leader who knew the dust of the way, the weight of the sword, and the tiredness of the escape. And more than that, David was anointed by God. Those who followed him were not noble. They were not rich. They were broken, indebted, persecuted men, the world that the world discarded, but who, by their side, became part of something larger. And that was where JABEZON wanted to be. The trip to David's hiding places was long. Between valleys and rocks, each shadow seemed to hide an enemy. Saul wanted David killed, and anyone who joined him was considered a traitor. But JABEZON didn't go back. Your decision was already made. When he finally came to the camp, the scene he found was not an organized army, but a flock of warriors forged in adversity. Men of attentive eyes, calloused hands, ready for the fight. And in the center of everything, David. Not a magnified king, but a simple man with a sharp look like a blade. When he spoke, his voice carried something that JABEZON had never heard before: authority and faith mixed like fire and steel. There among those men, JABEZON understood. It was not enough to want to fight, it was necessary to prove its value. And the first opportunity came faster than expected. The desert was not only a refuge, it was also a battlefield. David's enemies were not distant, and soon JABEZON's blade would be tested for the first time. In the first light in the morning, JABEZON was already standing. The smell of burned wood and sweat hovered in the air of the camp. Men sharpened swords, checked, tied sandals with automatic gestures, as if war were as common as breathing. He was not yet one of them, not completely. It was a stranger, a newcomer. And in battle times, confidence was not something given for free. It was conquered. David didn't need words to test a man. Opportunities came for themselves. And that morning, Jabezon's chance arrived. Sentinels brought news from a Philistia troop moving through the valleys south, plundering villages, leaving only ashes and bodies on the way. The answer was immediate. The camp has become a whirlwind of preparations. Horses were sealed, swords wielded, spears divided among the warriors. The silence carried the tension of those who knew that before sunset, the floor would be dyed with blood. Jabezon was designated for the rear, a place where the risk was theoretically lower. But the war does not know predictability. The attack began earlier than expected. The Philistines emerged as shadows between the rocks, agile and brutal. The chaos exploded, screams, metal shocking metal, dust rising in thick clouds. Jabezon didn't have time to hesitate. His first blow was clumsy, heavy, but the second found the target, and the third, and the fourth. He felt the adrenaline take over, the instincts taking control. The battlefield became a whirlwind of bodies in motion, and he was in the middle, fighting not only for life, but for the right to be there. When the dust settled, the Philistines retreated. David watched his men. Jabezon, panting, covered with sweat and blood, raised the blade, aware that something had changed. He was no longer a stranger, but being accepted among the warriors was just the beginning. The real test was yet to come. That night, David's camp was more alive than usual. Men sat around the bonfires, laughing, sharpening blades, remembering every detail of the battle. Jabezon, now dirty with dry blood and dust, felt the weight of exhaustion in the bones. But there was something different inside him. Fought, survived, and more than that, it was part of something larger. But among the warriors of David, a victory never meant rest. There was always another fight waiting soon. That same night, a messenger hurried, bringing new news. A Philistine detachment had taken a strategic position in one of the nearby valleys, blocking the way to the city of Bethlehem. It was not a battle like the others. David knew that place well. It was your homeland. The source from which he drank water as a boy now belonged to the enemy. No one had to ask what they would do. In the silence of the early hours of the morning, a small group of warriors was ready to leave. Among them, Jabezon. This time, it would not be in the rear. It was a dangerous foray, not an open war. A handful of men against an entire fortress. But courage in that company, it was worth more than numbers. The way to the valley was traveled in silence. The moonlight bathed the earth with a pale glow, making the shadows even deeper. In the distance, they could see the torches of the Philistines fluttering like a close eyes. Each step needed to be calculated. They could not be seen before the right time. They could not fail. When they finally reached the limits of the enemy camp, the warriors looked at each other. It was the moment. Swords were jammed. The air seemed to hold his breath. And then, in the blink of an eye, the silence was torn by the sound of the steel. The first blow fell like thunder in the darkness. The blade of Jabezon found flesh, and the muffled cry of the first Philistine barely had time to echo before another blow silenced any chance of fuss. The attack had begun. The enemy camp awakened amid chaos. Warriors coming out of their disordered tents, trying to understand where the attack came from. But it was too late. Jabezon moved as if he was born for that. Each step was accurate, every blow, I need. The training, the battles, the nights I had slept holding his sword, all had prepared it for this moment. He didn't fight alone. Around him, the other brave of David tore the enemy camp like a storm. The fire of the torch shaped, throwing gigantic shadows into the rocks of the valley, and for a moment it seemed that God's own warriors had become avenging, uncontrollable, and unmayable spectra. The mission, however, was not to decimate the enemy. They had a greater purpose, to reach the Well of Bethlehem. It was then that Jabezon realized. Between spears and shields, a small group of warriors stood out, paving the way through chaos. They were the three closest to David, advancing with a clear goal. He followed them without hesitation. The source was right forward, kept by still stunned Philistines. The fight was fast. JABEZON wasted no time. Its blade opened space, and the pitcher was filled with the water that David wanted so much. But what would happen later was something no one expected. The return was as intense as the attack. The enemies, now awakened, gathered forces. The arrows cut the sky, and each step was a struggle for survival. But in the end, they got it. They arrived at David's camp, presented the water to the king, and it was then that JABEZON saw something he would never forget. David held the pitcher, looked at the water like a treasure, and to everyone's surprise, poured it on the earth. The silence that followed was as intense as the battle. Crystalline liquid dripped down the arid floor, absorbed by the earth as an invisible offering. JABEZON was still, the chest still panting the race, the tense muscles. He fought, bleeding, risked his life to bring that water. And now, before her eyes, David spilled her without taking a single sip. But then something in the king's expression made everything fit. It was not contempt, it was not ingratitude, it was reverence. David's gaze reflected something deeper than simple thirst. "How could I drink the blood of these men who risked their lives?" His voice echoed through the camp, loaded with something larger than any order or strategy. That gesture was not a rejection of the warriors' sacrifice. On the contrary, it was a recognition that their courage was not banal. It was not something to be consumed as if it were just another act of war. JABEZON understood, and at that moment he realized why David was not like Saul. The king who had chosen to follow was not a man who sought power for power. He knew that the loyalty of his warriors was not a right, but a gift and present that could not be treated with lightness. The whole camp felt the weight of that moment. But the war is not over. If the Philistines had been challenged, they would certainly answer. And there were other enemies to the lurking: Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites. All wanted a piece of the kingdom that David was beginning to build. JABEZON had no doubt that more battles would come, and if David needed warriors willing to face any enemy, he was ready. The blood that covered his hands had not yet dried, but the next fight was already approaching. The dust of the battles never settled long. As soon as the Philistines were defeated, other enemies rose against Israel. Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites. All looked at David and saw a threat in it. They knew that if they did not stop it now, their reign would be strengthened. And that's exactly what happened. Military campaigns intensified. Each battle was a new fire test, and JABEZON increasingly became an essential piece in this war game. His sharp instincts, his unshakable resistance, and his courage always put him on the front line. Among the warriors, his name was no longer just one of the many. He was beginning to be recognized, respected, feared. It was during the war against the Ammonites that JABEZON lived one of the most decisive moments of his life. The Ammonites, combined with the Syrians, had fortified their cities and resisted fiercely. David sent Joab, his commander, to lead the attack. The siege of Rabbah, the capital of Ammonites, dragged on for weeks. The enemies resisted with all their strength, and the victory seemed distant. It was then that JABEZON received an almost impossible mission. The walls of the city were thick, protected by archers and sharp spears. But there was a vulnerable point: the entrance to the fortress. The problem: it was stored by dozens of Ammonitous warriors, prepared to kill anyone who dared to approach. It was the kind of challenge that made your blood boil. With a small group of brave, JABEZON infiltrated at night, moving as shadows in darkness. The first blade cut silence before the first scream could be given. The combat was brutal, every second a struggle for life. But JABEZON didn't go back. With quick and accurate blows, they paved the way to the gate, allowing Israel's army to advance. The dawn revealed the city in ruins, taken by the warriors of David. The flag of Israel was shaking at the top of the fortress, and JABEZON, covered with dust and blood, knew that this would not be his last great battle. The war was far from over. The smell of smoke still impregnated the air when JABEZON left the fortress conquered. The shouts of war had ceased, replaced by the sound of the soldiers collecting the spoils of victory. The city of Rabbah now belonged to David. The king finally consolidated his domain, but something in the air seemed different. It was not just another expired battle. It was the end of one era and the beginning of another. The enemies of Israel were weakened. The Philistines had been humiliated, the Ammonites subjugated, and the other neighboring nations knew that challenging David meant facing the wrath of an army trained in the desert flames. JABEZON looked around and saw the faces of his companions, men who had once been exiled, renegade, homeless, or destination. Now it was the most feared warriors in the region. But time spared no one. The battles had taken many. Some were killed in combat, others simply disappeared along the way. Even David was no longer the same. The pastor boy who had faced Goliath now was an experienced king, but also a man marked by difficult loss and decisions. And JABEZON, who had fought beside him for years, was beginning to feel the weight of time on his shoulders. The accumulated scars told stories that only the warriors understood. Each was a reminder that the body had limits. JABEZON was no longer the young man who had held his sword for the desert for the first time. But there was still strength in his arms and fire in his heart. He knew that as long as there were enemies of Israel, as long as there was a fair cause to fight, his sword could not rest. But the danger was not always coming from outside. David's biggest challenge was yet to come, and this time it would not be a battle fought in the field against foreign armies, but within the kingdom itself. The time of the great wars against external enemies seemed to have given way to something darker, more treacherous. It was no longer the Philistines or Ammonites who threatened David, had been his own home. JABEZON saw the signs. The king, who once led each battle on the front line, now spent more time inside the palace. The marks of time were on his face, but it was not just the age that weighed him. Something invisible consumed him. There were rumors, murmurs through the corridors. Some spoke of intrigues in court, others of wrong choices. And then came the most painful blow. Absalom, his own son, rose against him. Chaos spread like fire in the dry field. David, the king anointed by God, had to flee Jerusalem, humiliated, betrayed by the blood of his blood. For JABEZON and the brave, that was not just a political crisis. It was a war, but a different war. For this time the enemy was not a foreign people, but a prince of Israel, surrounded by those who once sworn loyalty to the king. The roads that were once ways of conquest became escape routes. JABEZON walked alongside the men who once saw David lift an empire. Now they saw him fleeing like an exile, as if the years of fighting mean nothing. But the story was not over yet. The final battle between father and son approached. The brave knew that when the moment came, they would not hesitate. And JABEZON, who sometimes faced enemy armies, knew this would be one of the most difficult fights. For the sword not only cuts the meat, she also divides hearts. The battlefield was taken over by the morning, a tense silence hanging over the Ephraim hills. The war between father and son had come to his climax, and JABEZON felt the weight of that moment as never before. He had already faced enemies in numerous battles, already toppled powerful warriors, but now, around him, he saw Israelites fighting Israelites, brothers spilling each other's blood. There was no glory in that war, just pain. David's order was clear: do not touch Absalom. But war does not respect feelings, and fate does not double the will of men. The young prince was found stuck in the twisted branches of an oak, vulnerable, defenseless. Joab, David's commander, did not hesitate. JABEZON was not there when the launcher crossed the body of the king's son, but when the news spread, he saw the impact on David's eyes. It was not the gaze of a victorious king, but of a torn father. The rebel army was crushed, Jerusalem resumed, the restored throne. But something had changed. The shine in David's eyes was never the same. And JABEZON knew that, as much as the king still ruled, the flame that had made him Israel's great leader was weakening. The years passed, and time, which was already charging its price, would not stop for anyone. The brave who once raised the kingdom now were few. Some fell into battle, others were consumed by their own destination. JABEZON, once young and fierce, now carrying the marks of a lifetime dedicated to war, but he knew his name would never be forgotten. Like David's other warriors, he had become more than a man, if he had made a legend, and the legends don't die. They live in the stories told to those who will come later, in the deeds that shape the future, in the echoes of a past that will never be erased. Time has passed like a river that never stops running. David aged, and with him, the men who fought by his side. The great warriors who were once feared on the battlefields now were just named names by young soldiers who never knew their exploits. But legends do not die. And JABEZON, his name, like that of the other brave, was recorded in the history of Israel. He did not seek glory, never fought for fame or recognition. His life was made of silent battles, unshakable loyalty, sacrifices that few have seen. And maybe that's the greatest lesson he has left. It is not the size of the sword that makes a great warrior, nor the number of victories that a man accumulates. The true value is what he chooses to defend, in faithfulness to his mission, even when no one is looking. JABEZON teaches us that courage is not absence of fear, but the decision to advance despite him. What strength is not only in the muscles, but in the resilience of those who do not give up. That a real warrior does not fight for himself, but for something greater. If a king, a promise, or a call. He was not king, did not use crown, but built a kingdom with his hands and blood. And so, your story goes through time, in each struggle faced, in every battle fought in the hearts of those who do not give up. Because we all somehow have our wars to fight. We all carry our invisible swords and see each other in the face of seemingly insurmountable walls. But it is at these times that we should remember JABEZON and move on, knowing that the real victory is not just to win, but to stay firm to the end. If you liked the story of JABEZON and want to keep following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to enjoy this video and share with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so as not to lose any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.